such terrible thoughts. You'd say that it won't happen, but you said you'd help and you haven't. I've been cutting everyone off, get a head start on my run. I won't be your sheep, your coin, or your son. Use the justice to spread against coherent yet unknown name. Oh, can you put me in codes? 'Cause I was born for this language game. To fall on one side means that I lie. On the other, I would die. I just crucify. I just crucify. I just crucify. I just crucify.
Hey everyone, welcome to Apocalypse Here, Christianity You Can Live With, for this live stream essay review this evening or whatever time it is, wherever you are. Thank you for joining me to kind of walk through this essay slash book chapter in the T&T Clark Companion to the Atonement. You'll notice, I think you can see, got some books that have been taken down. We're moving in the next few weeks to Laura and my new job in Roanoke, Virginia. So we're going a couple hours north from here in August. So we're busy working away at that. We've been gone for a couple weeks for vacation to visit family and to visit Laura's sister's new baby. Which is new birth in our family, which is, of course, wonderful. But again, thank you for tuning in. If you're not subscribed to the channel, please do. And of course, leaving a like or a comment is, of course, helpful for this channel to support us. So please do that if you wouldn't mind. But for today, we're going to be talking about Stephen Chapman's chapter in the T&T Clark Companion that I was just talking about. So let me pull up my slides. That's better. So what we're going to be talking about today is his account of atonement in the Old Testament. He emphasizes specifically Leviticus, which makes sense because that's where we get most of the sacrificial material. And this was published back in 2017 in the T&T Clark Companion to Atonement, which, if you can get access to it, it's really great. There are a lot of great chapters in that. So for people who are interested in the subject of atonement, this is something worth your time to read if you can get it. It may be very expensive. I have it in PDF format. So if you're interested and aren't wanting to spend a bunch of money on it, hit me up and I can hook you up with that. So Stephen Chapman is the associate professor of Old Testament at Duke Divinity School. He did all of his degrees beyond high school at Yale University / Yale Divinity School later on. So I have Chaps there in quotations and parentheses because that's what we call them. I had him as a professor a couple of times at Duke for a couple different OT courses, one of which was Karl Barth in the Old Testament. So I'm going to be referring to him as Chaps. That's not to say that if you ever encounter him that's an appropriate thing to call him, but that's what we call him. So I'm going to use that as a shorthand when I'm referring to him instead of calling him Stephen or Dr. Chapman. He's a key proponent of theological interpretation of the Bible more broadly, and also the Old Testament in particular. He's influenced heavily by Brevard Childs from Yale. I think I remember hearing him say at one point that he's either taken for credit or sat in on every single course that Brevard Childs ever taught. So he was very much influenced by Childs at Yale, and Childs was a really pioneer in canonical interpretation. And we see this specifically in his books, Biblical Theology in Crisis, and also Introduction to the Old Testament as Scripture. And he's focusing on the biblical canon itself as a finished kind of product. And he's highly critical of historical critical methods and their supposed sort of excising of theological concerns. So this is pretty popular kind of approach and a popular kind of response to historical criticism that took on, really took shape at Yale and then at Duke, and has a sort of legacy at both institutions. So that's kind of a bit of background about Stephen Chapman, or Chaps. So for this essay, really what he's doing is Chaps is talking about 5 ways that we misunderstand what the OT is doing with the atonement. The first is that the idea of atonement supplants God's broader vision of reconciling the cosmos to himself. The second misunderstanding is that the atonement needs to be understood in terms of propitiation. Basically means appeasement, usually to do with appeasing God's wrath, especially in terms of penal substitution, where God's retributive wrath is being appeased by some kind of blood sacrifice. In the model, more specifically, it's Jesus's blood sacrifice. Misunderstanding 3 is that the atonement is only a singular transaction between humans and God by means of some kind of blood sacrifice. 4, that the atonement is only about human beings. And 5, and finally, that God acts principally in a juridical way in the atonement and not in a cosmic and restorative way. And then at the end, he'll get into sort of Christian appropriations of this stuff. And it's a very short section at the end, but I'll talk about that as well. So let's get into misconception 1. Atonement is synonymous with divine reconciliation. So discussions of atonement in the OT tend to center on the words and the procedures around priestly sacrifices, which is pretty obvious. And as well as that with the suffering servant material. But Chaps notes that reconciliation in the Old Testament has a much larger frame of reference, entailing the broader sweep of the scriptures and its theological thrust. Much of the Old Testament concerns God in his mercy, reconciling his creation by establishing a covenant with particular people, Israel. And discussions of atonement in the OT rarely really address this sort of expansive picture. They tend to center in on just the sacrificial system. And Chaps uses the illustration of 2 circles of concern within the OT. An outer circle concerning the restoration of all things, and a sort of inner circle of God's forgiveness of sin. That outer circle, which is cosmic in its dimension, is what we'd refer to as reconciliation. Although it's still atonement, just atonement sort of in a broader sense. And then atonement in a narrower sense needs to be understood as part of the broader vision of God's reconciling of the whole cosmos. That inner circle is largely to do with the sacrificial theology of the Old Testament, and how to understand this theology, of course, is the cause of much debate. How do we understand the temple? But using the word atonement simply for that inner circle, which a lot of people do, quote, and this is from Chaps from page 97, quote, threatens to sever the essential link between the 2 related spheres, of God's reconciling work, resulting in an overemphasis on atonement's sacrificial aspect, end quote. So that's the first misconception. Misconception 2, atonement is properly about propitiation and penal substitution. So the question of whether atonement refers to propitiation or appeasement has been challenged ever since the publication of C.H. Dodd's important work in 1935 called The Bible and the Greeks. Dodd argued there that atonement should be understood as purifying or purging, and he uses the word expiation to kind of summarize that. This provoked defenses of the propitiation reading, and these defenses still run through to today. And the way that this was done, and still is done, is by lumping together two dimensions of propitiation: the implication of God's wrath and the vicarious nature of the sacrificial offering. So that results, of course, in penal substitution. And as Chaps says, PSA, quote, hardened into the main counterposition to Dodd's, end quote, after Dodd's publication. So now we're going to move to expiation in Leviticus. According to Chaps, Dodd's basic position on expiation was supported by key figures like Jacob Milgrom in particular in his work on the sacrificial system in the book of Leviticus. And Milgrom has written the Anchor Bible commentary on Leviticus, which is a classic at this point. And what Milgrom does is when he's analyzing the use of the word kippur in Hebrew, just loosely atone or whatever, Milgrom strongly argued that the rationale for Israelite sacrifice was purification of space, of the altar, and of the sanctuary. In addition, he read hatat, which is another word that's used in the sort of sacrificial system, as a purification offering, and not necessarily a sin offering, specifically. And during the hatat sort of procedure, quoting Chaps, the worshiper would present the required animal or animal substitute at the entrance of the tent of meeting. If presenting an animal, the worshiper would lay one hand on the animal's head and kill it, end quote. And then what happens then is the priest in this hatat sort of procedure takes the blood from the animal and tosses it several times in front of the curtain, separating off the tent's inner sanctum. And now I'm wishing that I could have had a kind of diagram of the temple here to kind of show you. So after this kind of throwing the blood in front of the curtain several times, the priest smears the blood on the horns of the incense altar and then pours the rest at the base of the sacrificial altar. Okay. And then he burns portions of the animal's entrails on the same altar, afterward disposing of the animal's remains outside the camp. What's key here in this procedure is, quote, it's not the focus of the rite. The killing is not the focus of the rite, i.e., the animal's death is not the main part of the sacrifice. It's only a means to an end. The animal is not killed by the priest, but by the worshiper. The animal is not killed on the altar, but at the tent's entrance, end quote. It's from page 99 of Chaps chapter. And sometimes the sacrificial offering wasn't even an animal, but sometimes it was grain as a substitute, sort of depending on economic reasons. And there was no blood that was spilled at all. See Leviticus 5:11 through 13. Now, the reason for the offering is, of course, debated. And for Milgrom, it's for the purpose of rinsing or purging impurities that have taken up residence in the worship space. Okay? It was kind of like a ritual detergent. As Chaps says, quote, Milgrom pointed to the verbal patterns in the description of the sacrifice. The subject of kippur, which is PL form in Hebrew, is usually the priest, he observed. But the direct object of kippur is never God or a person, a person can only be an indirect object of kippur, end quote, from page 99. So hatat blood is only applied to the sanctuary, not to a person. But Milgram doesn't really want to make a sharp distinction or a kind of preference for expiation over propitiation. It's not really what he's about. He really wants to say that God was genuinely affected by sacrifice. Not only purification, but forgiveness occurred at the end of the hatat. But the expiatory character of the kippur, in Milgram's interpretation, has remained widely influential, and I think rightfully so. And Chaps goes on to talk about the actual etymology of the word kippur, which is debated. It could have meant at one time cover or wipe clean or possibly ransom or something like that. But expiation does seem to be the best translation of the word within the present text of Leviticus. Many OT scholars currently agree that expiation was, quote, from Chaps, a fundamental aspect of what occurred in ancient Israelite worship, end quote. The open question, though, as Chaps writes, quote, is whether sometimes such worship might have also had a propitiatory or appeasing dimension, end quote, from page 100. Now, Leviticus 17:11 seems to represent an exception to the expiation approach, where atonement is somehow for the lives of the worshipers instead of the altar. Okay? But it's hard to actually know just how much of an exception this actually is. The phrase "for your lives," namely the lives of the worshipers in Hebrew, appears in Exodus 30:16. But in that context, it's talking about money instead of blood. So there seems to be a kind of ransom nuance going on there. Evangelical scholars, in the words of Chaps, quote, have frequently reconstructed the ransom idea at the root of the meaning of kippur, perhaps in combination with a purifying sense, in hope of providing support for penal substitution. That's from page 101, end quote. But this is all complicated, as the received form of Leviticus likely reflects a process of religious development and editorial revision. We can't just assume that everything in Leviticus is unified and has a kind of consistent and coherent conception of sacrifice as it once existed at a single moment in time. So expiation as representative and participatory. So Chaps notes that some will criticize the expiation approach by saying it doesn't include substitution, which is really just a bit silly. The altar is cleansed on the expiatory model for the sake of the worshiper and the community. It doesn't come close to ruling out a substitutionary dimension of the purification sacrifices. But an important alternative that has been provided by Hermet Getzu, who talks about participation, who talks about participatory identification instead of substitution in Israelite sacrifice. Quote from Chaps, which symbolized, above all, by the laying of hands upon the head of the sacrificial animal prior to killing it. End quote. So the sacrifice could be said to be on behalf of or for the community, whatnot, without including the idea of instead of the worshiper's own death. Those are two very different things. And Geza is sort of onto this stuff. It's not in the place of the worshiper dying. Okay? For Geza, hatat was participatory without being substitutionary in the way that is normally construed, preserving an ultimate goal of reconciliation. As Chaps writes, quote, his, Geza's, view is therefore able to affirm that in Israel's worship life, sins really were forgiven and broken relationships, in fact, were restored. One of the chief problems with the penal substitution view is that it all too often has been employed to undermine or negate the efficacy of the Old Testament sacrifices altogether, with some Christian theologians insisting that in and of itself, Israel's worship life was only a sham, end quote, from page 102. Now, the Day of Atonement is, of course, important to talk about, and Chaps turns to that here. The Day of Atonement ritual from Leviticus 16 is also often referenced to support the substitutionary view. But the text is clear that the atonement is actually completed before the scapegoat rite even begins. So this is from Leviticus 16:20. Quote, when he has finished atoning the holy place in the tent of meeting, in the altar, he shall present the live goat, end quote. There's obviously a representative aspect to what the scapegoat does. The goat is sort of carrying all iniquities, but the goat is neither killed nor sacrificed. The procedure is, as Chaps writes, quote, better interpreted as an elimination rite, analogous to Leviticus 14, 1 through 32, and Zechariah 5, 5 through 11, end quote, from page 103. So there's really little basis for interpreting the OT sacrificial procedures as substitutionary, let alone penal substitutionary. But expiation can still be understood in a participatory sense, or a representative, or a vicarious sense, and I would add even a certain sort of nuanced substitutionary sense, as long as it's not being controlled by a punitive or retributive dimension. So expiation as objective and necessary. Another criticism of expiation approach is that it doesn't take adequate consideration of God's justice or wrath. Okay? Of course, there's no way of getting around God's wrath in the Old Testament or God's demands for justice and righteousness. So it seems PSA advocates initially appear to be the ones who can make the most sense of God's wrath. But in Leviticus, the language of Kippur is not really used in a propitiatory manner. And it's pretty incredible how little appeal there is to God's anger or wrath in Leviticus. Some people will suggest that divine anger is present in the motif of a pleasant odor, right? Of certain burnt offerings or sacrifices. But this is really just smuggling in propitiation by glossing the phrase, usually, and I think more accurately translated as pleasant odor, glossing that phrase as soothing odor, which of course implies appeasement, and then simply asserting that the scent appeases God's wrath, right? There are a lot of extra steps there. We could say more simply that God is just pleased by the offering, right? Of course, we have other texts that depict atonement as a means of avoiding God's displeasure. So Numbers 16, 46 to 48, 2 Samuel 24, 21. But as Chaps writes, quote, a striking phenomenon within the Old Testament literature is in fact how rarely sacrifice is described or enjoined as a response to God's wrath. End quote, from page 105. The bigger problem here, however, is what the word penal is referring to in penal substitution. It's not just about judgment. There is judgment all over the Old Testament, but it's about retributive punishment. The issue isn't whether or not God gets angry at sin. Of course God does. But whether, in Chaps' words, quote, God demands retribution in the form of a legal penalty, end quote, from page 105. In the thought world of the Old Testament, sin is not just identical with a crime, right? There are certain instances where there is overlap. And even sometimes sin is not really a moral failing, but is sometimes a matter of impurity. So this is all very complicated, right? So let's move on to misconception 3. Atonement involves a single mode of reconciliation. Chaps continues that while offerings that include blood tend to dominate theological discussions of sacrifice, the OT contains multiple means of atonement. There were offerings and ceremonies that did not entail the shedding of any blood, or at least didn't focus on that, and yet, quote from Chaps, achieved reconciliation for the worshiper. Grain offering from 1 Samuel 3, 26, Leviticus 2, and 5 and 6 and 14. You have the application of oil in Leviticus 14 and 18, and then 26 to 29. Or of water, Leviticus 15, 5 through 12, and then 1 Samuel 7, 6. Or of wine in Exodus 29. A bird ritual in Leviticus 14. Scapegoat ritual, as we talked about in Leviticus 16. A ransom for military census in Exodus 30. Incense offerings in number 16. And so on and so on. The reason why Christians tend to overlook this stuff is because of the persistent stress on blood sacrifice in the theological tradition. But even in sacrifices that did involve blood manipulation, it was the manipulation itself that was ritually significant, not the killing of the animal per se. Okay? The killing was a preparatory act rather than the centerpiece of the atoning event. As Chaps writes, quote, both the variety and character of the atoning rituals argue against penal substitution model, end quote, from page 107. It should be clear that the OT describes atonement as more than just sacrifice, more than just a blood sacrifice, too. And at points, sacrifice actually exists in significant tension with some prophetic scriptures, which I'm sure you know. Let's go to misconception 4. Atonement pertains only to people. In much of the Old Testament, we see humans and the rest of the animal world sharing a predicament. So Chaps argues that atonement shouldn't be confined to dealing with the human condition alone, but as addressing all living things, and indeed the cosmos itself. So Chaps writes, quote, along with Israel, God rescued animals from Egypt, Exodus 12. They're God's covenant partners alongside human beings, Genesis 9, Hosea 2. And as such, they have certain legal rights and responsibilities, end quote. So the idea that there's a special mode of reconciliation called atonement that just applies to human beings actually kind of distorts the biblical witness in the Old Testament. And perhaps ironically, quote from Chaps, animal sacrifice therefore reflects the high religious value of animals in the creaturely world, in Israel's worldview, rather than being an act of neglect or denigration or abuse, end quote, from page 109. So misconception 5, divine agency is exclusively forensic and not at all cosmic. For this final misconception, Chaps talks about how we shouldn't conceive of God's justice as a series of discrete verdicts given by some distant judge. Righteousness, tzedakah, is fundamentally relational in the Old Testament, quote, often amounting to a conception of world order, end quote. And along with this, divine agency should be reconceptualized away from depicting God simply and most basically as a distant judge or sovereign imposing direct consequences. God seems to be working through human beings, through events, through the natural world, and on all sorts of occasions. As Chaps writes, quote, God can use harmful human intentions in the Bible to bring about good, Genesis 50, harness a strong east wind to deliver Israel from Egypt, Exodus 14, and employ the Assyrians to execute judgment upon Israel, Isaiah 10. Particularly noteworthy is the act-consequence model of causation found throughout the various Old Testament traditions, end quote. So while certain OT texts will depict God as the sovereign judge, God is also perceived as ratifying or suspending the presumptive creational logic already attached to act and their consequences. As Chaps sums things up. It's going to be a bit of a longer quotation. Quote, God cannot altogether dispense with retribution, because in this fashion, the operation of justice is woven into the very fabric of creation. Genesis 18:25. In creating the world, God has in effect agreed to honor creation structures and natural processes. God expects human beings to live in accordance with creation's, quote, structural justice, end quote. And God feels pain when humans are irresponsible with their moral stewardship. The requirement for atoning blood is thus not within God, but within the world that God has made. This insight opens up the possibility of construing the need for atonement as more creational, more in line with the pain and suffering existing within the natural world, even within the process of evolution itself. Sacrifice is enjoined because of the brokenness of creation, which results in a self-perpetuating cycle of violence, compared to Hosea 4:1-3. In Israel's understanding, repentance and sacrifice break the cycle by surrendering violence to God. So Deuteronomy 30, and compared to Romans 12:19. In this way, Old Testament sacrifice can be viewed as staging and redirecting creational violence rather than enacting the violence of God. End quote. So in this final section of the essay, Chaps talks about how Christians often take a particular, and I would add incorrect, interpretation of somebody like Paul, and then read Paul into Hebrews, and then Hebrews back into Leviticus, thereby unwarrantedly controlling the meaning of the sacrificial words and stories and procedures that we find there. But a more careful consideration of the OT reveals the cosmic sweep of God's reconciling work that will help correct our limited models of atonement from certain readings of the NT data. But within the ancient tradition, sacrifice is viewed as primarily about reconciliation with God. And it's also, quote, expiatory, representative, and vicarious in nature, end quote, from page 112. The OT prevents us from saying that God is punishing Jesus for human sin. Instead, it appears that Jesus, quote, completely identified himself with creaturely life and experienced the full extent of creation's estrangement from God, end quote, from page 113. Chaps concludes his book chapter by saying how Jesus takes up the broader vision of OT reconciliation. Quote, in becoming humanity's sacrifice, the Lamb of God decisively broke the cycle of creational violence and thereby demonstrated how it could continue to be broken by abjuring self-defense, Matthew 26, and vengeance, 1 Peter 2, and by embodying forgiveness, Luke 23 and Acts 7, as well as self-sacrifice in Philippians 2, 5-11. So that's the article. I have a link to it in the description of this video. Just a few words by way of reflection on this. I would have liked to see Chaps engage a bit more with retributive justice in all of this. I think at the end he's conceding a bit too much. I'm not saying that in principle I'm not comfortable with seeing retribution in the Old Testament. That's fine. I'm not really worried about that. But how to make sense of that theologically, I think, would be something to at least begin to address in a book chapter like this. The other thing is, I wish there was a bit more positive stuff here. It seems like a lot of what he's doing is sort of pushing back against certain sorts of penal substitution readings of atonement as derived from the Old Testament, which is fine. That's great. But I didn't get a whole lot about what is atonement in the Old Testament, other than, it's about God's sort of larger reconciling activity that the temple is sort of a part of in some way, and that Jesus's death and resurrection is a part of in some way. There's not a lot more in terms of the positive aspect of this, and I would have liked to see that a little bit, to see where he's going, but it was a long chapter, kind of on its own, so I don't blame him. And I think it's important. I think it's important to actually give this kind of pushback against penal substitution readings of the Old Testament, because I think he's totally right that there's no real warrant for it coming out of the sacrificial system. It's a lot of reading back into it, like I said, from a particularly bad reading of Paul through Hebrews, from Hebrews back to Leviticus, and that sort of infects the rest of our reading of the Old Testament, right? So that's what I have to say. If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat now. I saw Spartan's comment with I think this is really helpful. Let me pull this up. I think a bit more information about sacred and profane space would have also been helpful. Yeah, I mean, he's taking a lot of that stuff for granted, for sure. The idea is that expiation is assuming that the worshiping space can be kind of infected. And so atonement is to sort of purge the worshiping space or to cleanse it of this infection that's kind of coming in. So it's the infection of the profane coming in to a sacred space that needs to be removed. So it's definitely related. It's definitely not a different topic by any means. I think he was just taking that for granted. It's hard when you're writing these little academic pieces to get into all of that. But you're right. I think that could have been something to spell out a bit more for sure. But if anyone has any more questions, I'm going to see if I more digital gnosis was here for a little bit. All right, when you listen to this tomorrow, let me know what you think. I think generally Chaps is right on this stuff. I've learned a lot from him. So, I don't see any more questions. But if you have any questions or comments, do leave them in the comments section of this video. Hit me up on Twitter. Don't forget to like the video. And if you're not subscribed, definitely subscribe to the channel for sure. But this has been Apocalypse here. Christianity you can live with. Thanks, everyone.